I'm going to start up here so I can show off my suit. I told the good professor last night he had a choice, either my suit or my sequined bikini. And he chose the suit, so this is the suit. It's my only suit. I noticed the obvious, that with some exceptions, obviously, there are a great many females in this audience. I'm sorry, I'm not Colin Firth. He's not going to be here today, so you can all leave and the men will stay and we'll talk about movies. But I apologize right off the bat for not being able to speak in your beautiful language. My father spoke 8 languages. I can hardly speak English, so I didn't inherit that talent, and I apologize. But I must say, and this being an ecclesiastical institution, you will understand this, that I believe that when I eventually die in 200 or 300 years from now, I will go to hell because I have already been to paradise. I have been in Italy. Thank you very much. The title that was given to this speech, not by me, but it's a good title, the Long Journey of the King's Speech. So we're going to talk about journeys. And it brings up a philosophical question. What is important? And I ask you to ask yourself this question continually. What is important? Is it the end of the journey? Is it the glittering prize? Or is it the journey itself? Is the journey the glittering prize? I can only tell you about my journey in this story, and maybe you'll learn something from a few of the things I did right, and maybe you'll learn even more from some of the things I did wrong, because that is the only way to learn. Somebody asked me earlier today, what's the biggest advice I can give to writers, young writers? Write, 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 write. You can only learn from making mistakes. It's the only way to learn. So my first mistake, and I'm sure many of you share this, is I made a very bad choice of parents. They were not wealthy. You know, a trust fund would be a very good thing for a young writer. And I commiserate with those of you who, like me, do not have a trust fund, but that's the way it goes. You just have to make do with it. The story of the King's Speech, the journey of the King's Speech, actually has a slight Italianate start, or Italy played a little part in it. My very first memory, and I was just under 3 years old, my father and his brother, my uncle, they had built a sandbox for me. We were living in Lingfield on the Surrey coast. And there were 2 things I recall. They say you don't remember much before you're 3, but I remember a couple of things. One was barbed wire fence, and these very nice men on the other side of the fence. And they all had beautiful brown eyes, and they smiled. And they were Italian prisoners of war that were being held. And they seemed like really nice guys. They will come into the story again very quickly, you'll see. My first strong memory is my father and my uncle had built a sandbox for me, and I was helping them paint it, which meant I had a brush with paint and was, you know, throwing paint around. And I could hear distant sounds, boom, boom, boom. And I wanted to know what those noises were. And my uncle and my father lied to me. They said, "Oh, David, it's a storm. Don't worry, it's a storm." Well, I knew it couldn't be a storm. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. I mean, I wasn't that stupid for a little kid. So I later learned these were the guns of Dunkirk. It was the Battle of Dunkirk across the water. And the next thing I remember, I'm on a boat. And what had happened was the English government had decided to try to get as many families out of England as they could before the German invasion, which was inevitable. And it was hard to send families out. The qualifications were the father, the head of the household, for whatever reason, could not be in the military. My father had been in World War I, so he wasn't going to be in World War II. And the head of the household had to be able to support the family overseas. My father had a business with an office in New York, so we qualified. And we went out 3 boats, a convoy of 3 boats, 2 ships filled with families such as mine, and a 3rd ship filled with Italian prisoners of war. These same guys that I had remembered, or maybe they were the same guys. And they were being shipped out of England because when the Germans invaded, they didn't want the Italian prisoners rioting in their prisoner of war camps and starting a second front. So they were going to ship them to Canada. And we were escorted by fighter planes for the first few days, and then we were out of range, and the U-boats started coming in. And they asked the men on the ship to be volunteers at night for submarine watch. And my father was on submarine watch, and he saw a periscope in a submarine, and bells went off, and everybody got very excited. It was a whale. It was a whale spouting. So my father was asked not to be on submarine watch anymore. But one of the ships was sunk. And as tragedy would have it, it was the ship filled with Italian prisoners of war. And they were all locked in the hold of the ship. They all perished. I think 7 survived. It's a story, tragic story that nobody talks about. The English don't talk about it, the Germans don't talk about it, the Italians don't talk about it. Maybe one of you would like to write a story about it one day. The reason this is the beginning of the story of the King's Speech is that these dramatic events, for which I was given no explanation, they were the trigger of my stuttering. So by the time I arrived in America, in New York, and saw the Statue of Liberty, I was stuttering. And as my stuttering progressed and the war progressed, my parents would encourage me to listen to the BBC World program and hear the King give his wartime speeches. And they said, listen to him, David. He was much worse than you. And listen to him now. He's not perfect, but he can give wonderful speeches that the world listens to. So there's hope for you. So I grew up always admiring King George VI. He was my childhood hero. And as I got a bit older and realized that I liked lying so much that I wanted to become a writer and tell stories, I decided that one day I would write something about King George VI. I had no idea what, but something. And I seriously began thinking about it at university. I was going to Cornell University, and I thought, all right. And I picked up one of the official biographies of George VI, terribly boring book. Nothing much happened. You know, you all know what it's like in universities. There are exams, there are parties, which are more important. You know, not a lot gets done. So nothing much happened. A bit later, I was a playwright in residence after university at the San Francisco Actors Workshop. And a very close friend of mine in those days was the novelist Thomas Pynchon. And he was living with me and my wife, and we decided we would write a musical about George VI. He thought that would be lots of fun, you know, a chorus line of Grenadier Guards, but nothing happened. It was San Francisco in the 60s, nothing got done. The next time I seriously thought about it, many things had happened. I traveled in the South Pacific. I was back in America, in Hollywood, trying to make a last attempt to be a writer. Now, I arrived in Hollywood when I was 40 years old, which is the age when anybody with any sense is leaving Hollywood. Because your career is over at 40. That's it, you're finished. But that's when I arrived, because I didn't know any better. And I was very fortunate. My first job was writing Tucker for Francis Coppola. My second job was writing the soap opera Days of Our Lives. This is how you start and go downhill. I was very good at doing this because Tucker took 10 years to get made. But having written it, I was so naive and so stupid, I was under the illusion that now I could write anything I wanted in Hollywood. I very quickly learned that that is not the case. But at first I didn't know it. And I started reading heavily, and there were these little blips on the radar screen called Lionel Logue. Not much is written about him. There's a reason for that. He was a speech therapist, and the royal stutter was, and I think even today, is still a source of embarrassment, because it was called a speech defect. If you had a defect, you were a defective person. And you couldn't have the King of England be a defective person. Don't forget, this was the same era that the President of the United States was never seen without a blanket covering his polio-withered legs, because it was a sign of weakness. So, not much is out there about Lionel Logue, but enough that I knew, I think that's the story. And then I saw in one of the little tiny accounts that maybe he wasn't quite what he seemed to be, and I thought, that's interesting. So I wrote to a friend in London and asked if they could do some detective work for me. And I think she looked in the telephone directory. I think that's the extent of being the detective. But she came up with the name of one of Logue's children who was still alive. An elderly gentleman, retired brain surgeon on Harley Street. I wrote to him. This was before email, before faxes. You know, it was mail that went on a ship and went across the ocean, and it took a long time. And he wrote back very generously, and he said, yes, if you'd like to come to London, I'll speak with you. And I have the notebooks that my father kept while treating the king. Well, that seemed like the Dead Sea Scrolls to me. That's, everything I wanted. But he had a little caveat, tiny little thing. He said, before I see you or show you anything, you must write to the Queen Mother and get her permission. Okay. This is when my American friends realize that I am still half English, because an American would say, write to the Queen Mother? Yeah. But I wrote to the Queen Mother, and I waited, and in due course, beautiful buff-colored envelope with a big red stamp on it from Clarence House. And she said, dear Mr. Seidler, please, not in my lifetime, the memory of those events is still too painful. I knew what she meant. She felt that being forced to become king had hastened her husband's death and killed him prematurely. And she didn't want to be reminded of it. And again, I'm an Englishman, if the Queen Mother says wait, you really should wait. And I didn't think I had to wait that long. She was a very old lady. 25 years later, she had her last gin and tonic at age 103. So I had to be a little patient. But then I was free to write it. I didn't do it right away. I was involved in some contracts. And then I I was diagnosed with cancer. At the time, it seemed very, very serious. And it's startling news to get as a Christmas present, and I felt extremely sorry for myself. But after a couple of days of producing a great deal of mucus and tears, I realized that this was bad for my health. Grief is actually very bad for your health. It lowers your immune system, and your immune system is your only real friend and ally. So I thought, no, I've got to get my mind off of how sorry I feel for myself. And my mind cannot walk and chew gum at the same time. So I should get to work creatively and get my mind off of my concerns. By the way, may I say that in spite of the dire prognosis, I've been in remission ever since, and my doctor actually asked me the other day, he said, David, you're going to have to start looking. And I said, what? What do I have to look for? He said, you're going to have to look for something else to die of. So I assured him I will find something eventually, but it's all right. So I thought, well, if I'm not going to write Bertie's story now, when exactly am I going to write it? So I set to, and I started to write it as a screenplay. I got about 60 pages, 70 pages into it, and I had that funny feeling, I'm not sure. So I showed it to my then wife and writing partner, not on all projects, obviously, not on this project. And she's a very bright woman, and she read it, and in the most diplomatic term possible, she said, well, there's some very nice things in it, but you are getting, it's diffuse. There are subplots, and you're getting seduced by cinematic technique. Why don't you, simply as a writing exercise, put the screenplay away and write it as a stage play? Because the physical limitations of the theater will force you to focus on your key relationships. The King's Speech, after all, is two men in a room. And if you get that tentpole nice and solid, you can hang everything else off of it like Christmas tree ornaments. So it sounded like very good advice. So I threw away 70 pages of script, which, as writers, you will all know is not an easy task to do. And I wrote it as a stage play, as an exercise. But having finished it, I thought, I don't know, I think it's kind of good. I had started as a playwright when I was in my early 20s, but found it remarkably difficult to earn a living doing that. But I'd always loved theater and always wanted to return to the theater. So I sent the stage play to some friends who had gone on to have real careers on Broadway. And they raved. They said, oh, it's wonderful, it's marvelous. But there was only one problem. They were all ex-girlfriends. They were actresses. And you know, you can't believe actresses. You can't, particularly if they're ex-girlfriends. So, didn't know what to do about that. Then I remembered that I had my roommate, my flatmate at university, wonderful black man who I've remained very close friends with over the years. And he has a nephew who is a playwright who had lived in London and had had a few things done on the fringe. So I sent it to him because he obviously was not an ex-girlfriend. Well, that's pretty obvious. In this day and age, you're not so sure. I sent it to him, and he said, no, this is wonderful, and I know just the person to send it to. And we sent it to a woman by the name of Joan Lane, a wannabe theatrical producer who had been ex-BBC and was now earning her living producing special events for the royal family. She had actually produced the Queen Mother's 100th birthday party. So she took it under her wing and tried to get it going. One of the things she did, and you will see some of this in a few minutes, she organized a stage reading at the Pleasance Theater in Islington. It's simply a reading with 3-4 hours rehearsal on the day of the reading, and it's actors, semicircle of chairs, holding script. It's very rough, but it gives you kind of an idea of whether it's working or not. And afterwards, a nice couple, not elderly, middle-aged couple, came up, tears in their eyes, saying, "Oh, it's so wonderful, Mr. Seidler. Can we send the play to our son?" I said, "Yeah, send it to your son. I don't care." I didn't know who they were. Afterwards, I was told that they were the parents of Tom Hooper. So I thought, oh, it's a very good idea, you send it to your son. So it went off to Tom Hooper. Nothing happened. 6 months, nothing, so forgot about him. Then I got a phone call from Joan Lane one day, and I have to describe her to you a little bit so you understand. She's sort of a Sloane Ranger version of Auntie Mame, okay? Does that make any sense? Everybody is darling. It's all very theatrical. So she called me up one day and she said, "Darling, I have this lovely little Australian girl who works for me, and she's going home for Christmas, and she's going to pop a synopsis under the door of Geoffrey Rush's home." She lives only 2 or 3 blocks from where Geoffrey Rush lives, because I had always wanted Geoffrey Rush to play Lionel Logue. And I had tried to reach him through his Australian agent and had gotten a very cold shoulder. She really just, no. So now Joan Lane says, "You're popping it through his mailbox." And I said, no, you're not. That is so amateur, that is so dreadful. I cannot associate my name with such a thing. You mustn't do it. She said, "Oh, sorry, darling, it was done last night." 24 hours later, we get an email from the Australian agent who had been so very snotty to me when I tried to approach him, saying, "Mr. Rush is very interested and would like to read the play." All right, so the play was sent to Mr. Rush. Nothing happened. Nothing. 6 months went by. I knew I was right. He realized what a ridiculous thing this was, and he had burned the script, I'm sure. I was now, once a year, I go to New Zealand to visit my son and torment the trout. Or as my son puts it, torment my son and visit the trout, but whichever way. I do this, and I was fishing on the western bays of Taupo, a very remote area. You could only get there by boat. And I was living in a tent, and it had been raining for 8 days solid, the way it can do in New Zealand. And I have a very good tent, but even a very good tent, after 8 days of downpour, had sprung leaks. There was rain coming down. My sleeping bag was like a sponge. It was miserable. I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning needing to relieve myself, and I saw my iPhone was glowing, and I looked down and there was a text message. "Geoffrey Rush has read the play, loves it, won't do it on the stage, but will attach himself to the film." Well, how do you celebrate in a wet tent at 2 o'clock at night? So I was sort of jumping up and down on my wet sleeping bag, going squish, squish, going yay, yay. And that sort of got things going. That's how things began with the film. Now, during the Oscar season, subsequently, I was criticized by some critics. The film was criticized as being Oscar bait, that we had deliberately sat down, made a list of everything that an Oscar film needs, and wrote that film. Well, of course, that's nonsense. I've been thinking about it for 30 years, and our first vision of this was it was going to be a little BBC4 3-camera, £1 million production. No thought of theatrical release, no thought of movies. So it wasn't really written as Oscar bait. But suddenly, now with Geoffrey attached, it was beginning to pick up momentum. And the dreaded Harvey Weinstein decided that he was going to invest in this. which was great. It really got the ball moving. And then, out of the blue, Mr. Hooper woke up. And I got an email one day from Tom saying, "I've read your play. Are the rights available?" And I said, "No, the rights are already gone, but the job of directing is available." And he said, "Well, I have to be in LA tomorrow because awards for John Adams, and I'd love to read it." Well, I was just finishing a polish of the first draft for the producers. They hadn't read it. And I did something that's very naughty and something none of you must do because it'll ruin your careers. I'm serious, this can really get you into trouble, but nonetheless I did it. I knew if I sent the script to London for the producers to read, they were very slow. By the time they got back to me weeks later, Tom Hooper would be gone. We'd never get him again. So I didn't send it to the producers first. I sent it to Tom Hooper. I delivered it to the Chateau Marmont, where he was staying, with a very large box of licorice all sorts, because all good English people eat licorice all sorts when they go to the movies. So I thought this would help him digest the screenplay. The next day, he appeared at my doorstep, waving the script, saying, "This is the best thing I've ever seen in my career, and if we were filming tomorrow, I would be sleeping well tonight." Well, 56 drafts later, I did remind him of that, but that is how the process began, and that's how we got going. I think it might be interesting at this point to just break my talking too much and show you a little bit of footage, because that's more fun. What I've decided to do is I've taken some scenes. The first version is from the staged reading in London at the Pleasance Theatre in Islington in 2009. It's very rough and ready. I mean, it's very, very rough, okay? Then the same scene as seen in the film with Colin Firth. You see, you women, it's not wasted, you get to see Colin. But from the film, and I've used the Italian language version because I thought it might be more fun for you. The third version of the scene is from the West End production that Adrian Noble directed. Unfortunately, it is very, very rough footage. It's a single solitary stationary camera, and the quality is not good at all, but it will give you an idea of how the scene was done there. And then finally, just to show you how different these things, that the journey never ends, really, is what I'm trying to communicate here. The journey is never over. There is always changes and growth. And the fourth version is in Finnish, a production done in Helsinki, Finland. Anyone here from Finland? Anyone understand Finnish? No, but it's fine. You'll enjoy it. It's a very good production, and hopefully, if I ever have to do this again, I'll be able to have a fifth version in Italian, because we're very honored today that Luca Barbareschi, who is directing it here in Italy and playing the role of Logue, is in the audience today, and I think I saw him.
He was here, yes, but I think he's gone.
That was fast.
He was fast, because he was there, but I don't see him now.
Okay. Anyway, there is going to be an Italian version.
It's going to interpret Lionel also.
Yes, and he's playing Lionel. So let's play the first group of scenes, and it's the opening scene of the play and of the movie. Okay? As you can see, there are many ways of doing the same scene, and the progression and the journey never stops, because I have no idea of how it'll be in Rome. I've seen a production in German in Vienna a few weeks ago. It was wonderfully Germanic. There was one scene, the set had movable walls, and I just knew this was going to happen. I knew no German director could resist this. There's one moment where the walls are moving and they're sort of closing in, and Bertie is trapped between the walls that are closing in on him, just in case you didn't understand that he might be under pressure. But it was lovely German expressionism. There is a production currently playing in Japan. I have no idea what it looks like. I'd love to see it. I know how I would love to do it in Japan. It would be the Emperor's, we'd take a little liberties, the Emperor's speech. Because imagine the shame and humiliation of a Japanese emperor who couldn't speak publicly and has to be helped by a Korean speech therapist. Oh, terrible humiliation. There's going to be a production in Peru, Australia, who knows? So in a certain sense, the journey, the creative journey never stops. The creative journey certainly didn't stop for me as soon as we went into production. Tom Hooper arrived on the scene. He requested my time. I came to London from Alto Adige, worked with him for 2-3 months, very hard. And I had thought that when I made the adaptation from the stage play back to a screenplay, and everyone said, yeah, we love it, we're going to do it, I thought my job was done. I learned that my job had just begun, because I thought I had taken out all the theatrical aspects. But Tom Hooper did teach me something, that these are such different animals, and there was still so much theatricality left that wasn't going to work on film. And he was right. I mean, he made me cut some of the best lines, but he was right. I'll give you an example, and then I will sort of show you an example. Did I leave my water up there?
Yes.
A glass? Could I?
Yes, it's coming.
Thank you so much. This is what happens when you talk too much, you know. You get dry mouth. In the play, there are 3 characters that act as almost a Greek comic chorus. It's Stanley Baldwin, Cosmo Lang, and Winston Churchill. And they're like the 3 old guys in the Muppets. You know, the 3 old guys in the Muppets who are up there saying, "Ah, ah, 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 ah." And that's kind of the purpose they served. And they're wonderfully mischievous, very cynical. And Tom said, we can't have that in a movie. It will work on stage, but not on a film. It all has to go. And so it all went. Yeah, we're going to do number 3, by the way. We'll do scene 3. The other thing that he changed, and this I did, it's the only thing I fought him on, and I did lose. But in history and in my play is the fact that George V, Bertie's father, was he was euthanized. He was going to die, there's no question of it, but they wanted the news to be released first by the BBC and by the Times of London. They didn't want the disreputable afternoon newspapers breaking the news because they couldn't be trusted not to mention at this point the relationship between David, Edward VIII, and Wallace Simpson. Up until then, although the newspapers around the world had had news about it, no English newspaper had published a word of the relationship between David, and Wallace. That's how under the thumb the British papers were at the time. But now they were afraid that with the death of George V, the afternoon papers would have a field day if they were given the chance. So it was very important for them to have the news broken by the BBC and by the Times of London. But the deadline for both of those institutions was midnight. And it was now getting to be 11:30, and the king still hadn't died. It was very inconvenient. So they killed him. They gave him an injection of, they gave him morphine and cocaine and a couple of other things, and he went out a happy man, but he went out, probably an hour or so before his time was really up. It's quite shocking. I wanted it in my piece, not simply because it was shocking, not for salacious reasons. I wanted it in there to show the immense power the media now had. I mean, up until this point in history, kings didn't have to worry about the media. They gave speeches from balconies that nobody could hear anyway, and they just had to look good in their uniform. And as I have King George V say in my play, all we had to do is make sure we didn't fall off our horse, and we could be king. But now they had to say things. And so I wanted to show the power of the media, because this would underscore what Bertie was going to have to face. But Tom Hooper and the producers felt that it was such a controversial scene that it might overpower the film, and it got cut, much to my regret. And I think, and you be the judge, you'll see that scene in a few minutes. The air is let out of the balloon a little bit. There's no tension going. And so there's a bit of a sag at that point in the movie. Whereas in the plays, that doesn't happen. So this is a bit of a long sequence, but again, it saves my voice. And I think it's, are you enjoying seeing these footages? Yes? Okay, so let's do this. This is the scenes, and some of the editing that was done for me on this went a little too long, but nonetheless, these are the 4 versions of the death of George V, and I urge you to pay particular attention to the Finnish version in Helsinki, because what they do with the staging is so wonderful. I would like it to be in every production from now on, but you'll see what I mean. Okay, number 3.
Injected into the distended jug.
The editor put this DVD together. He didn't follow my instructions. This is way too long a segment. It's taking too long, so we'll cut this one here. The reason I had wanted you to see the Finnish one, the Helsinki one, is they really do the 3 old guys from the Muppets. They bring Stanley Baldwin, Winston Churchill, and Cosmo Lang. And what's really lovely is they stage their scene in a men's urinal. They go into the men's restroom to relieve themselves. There's a white wall of tiles to block, obviously, what you don't want to see. And of course, who is the person who takes the longest to urinate but Winston Churchill? It's very funny, and I'd love to use that in every version. I guess we're beginning to run short of time now. So there's a choice. We can do some Q&A, which I'm more than happy to do. Or if you don't want to ask questions, there is the final scene I had, which is the scene I'm sure you all came to see, which is the F-word scene. And let me explain maybe how that scene came into being, because that's also part of the journey. They tell writers, young writers, write what you know, write about yourself, what you know. And the problem is that young writers, including myself, take that literally. It doesn't mean you have to write about you, Anna, you, Guido, in the scene. That's not what it means. It means write about what you know internally. Some people can write about themselves, and I applaud them. That's a great gift. I have never been able to do that. I can't conceive that anybody would be interested in David Seidler. I could have written a movie about David Seidler, the little boy who stuttered, but I couldn't do it. I literally could not do it because I couldn't, in my mind, see anybody being interested. But if there is a king who doesn't want to be king, who's forced to be king, he's not ready to be king, he doesn't have the skills to be king, and his nation is facing a historical crossroads where they need a king, then the stakes become very high, and the fact that he stutters and has to overcome it is terribly important. So I was able to write about my own personal experience disguised as somebody else with greater meaning. And people have questioned the F-word scene. Now, everything that I put in of Lionel Logue's techniques is accurate. It's based on things we know he did, except that scene. I cannot categorically prove that he did that, although many therapists do. Many speech therapists do. They get the stutterer to swear because often in the passion of swearing, you forget to stutter. And then it's just added proof to the patient. You see, it's not physiological. It's not inbuilt. It's the same as singing. You cannot stutter when you sing. It's physical impossibility. So they get you to sing. And they say, see, you don't stutter. The same as if you block out the sounds, if you cannot hear yourself stutter, you cannot stutter. You don't stutter. A technique that Logue used. The swearing is very personal. I had reached the age of 16. I knew perfectly well, because I had been told, that if you don't get control over your stuttering by adolescence, your chances then go down. It doesn't mean you cannot cure it as an adult, but it's much more difficult. The fact that Bertie continued in his 20s, 30s, 40s means to me he was very brave. But I had reached 16. The hormones were raging. I couldn't ask girls out on a date. And even if I had written a note and said, would you go out with me? And they had said yes, what was the point? I couldn't talk to them. And this was the 50s, and on dates in the 50s, you talked. Not like today, you see. So at first I was very depressed. But I'm not a person who stays depressed for very long. I get very defiant. So I found myself jumping up and down on my bed in my bedroom, shouting the F word, and saying basically, this is unfair. Why have the gods inflicted this terrible thing on me? I didn't do anything wrong. I'm a good kid. I didn't sleep with my mother. I didn't kill my father. Why have they visited this affliction upon me? So, F word, all of you. If I am stuck with this F-word stuttering, you are stuck with listening to me. I have a voice, I have a right to be heard. I'm going to keep on stuttering, and you're just F-word going to have to listen. That psychological turn, that act of defiance, changed everything. Within 2 weeks, I was no longer stuttering. Not quite as clean as that. A little bit, particularly in foreign languages or reading, I still stuttered a bit. But basically my stuttering vanished within 2 weeks, and I was auditioning for the school play. I even got a role, a very small role. It was George Bernard Shaw's Androcles and the Lion. I played a Christian being eaten by a lion in the Colosseum, but I didn't stutter as I died. So that is how that scene came about. That's why I put it in. It was not to be salacious. It was not to shock. It was not to offend. It is part of the therapeutic process. So We can either see how that's been done a few times, or I'm very happy to take question and answers at 6 o'clock, and I realize you all want to go and have a smoke and a beer.
Yes. I think we have 15 minutes more, 10, 15, so yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.